Always remember, my pupil master used to say, the only law continually in force is the law of unintended consequences. Legal practitioners are less likely to forget this, but we look on in dismay as politicians do so as a matter of routine. Today's podcast is about that perennial internet standby. Are social media entities like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, are they publishers or are they something else? Starting from the top, it's important to remember that the publishers and platforms distinction that you often see in media commentary is not a legally significant one. The question is simply whether they are publishers or not whether they are something else that is not a publisher. That's fairly important to keep in mind. Now, by way of background, I'll explain that I'm a lawyer. I used to practice in this area, and it's becoming increasingly clear that it is very fraught, and there are all sorts of problems that emerge from it. Most obvious example, obviously, recently, is Facebook banning a number of outspoken commentators. Most of them were people who were associated with the political right or conservatism, and most of them were American. One of them wasn't. That was Reverend Louis Farrakhan, who's a Nation of Islam figure in the United States, and could probably be described as a black conservative, but because of the way African-American politics works in America, he is considered to be on the political left rather than on the political right, which is quite striking, but he does have quite socially conservative views, as you would expect from someone who is Muslim, but he's also quite anti-Israel, which you would also expect from someone who's Muslim, so he's quite a complex figure. However, the most prominent British person who was banned was Paul Joseph Watson, who's often considered to be alt-right, but there's a lot of argument over what alt-right means. It's very clear he's not a racist. There's this sort of fashionable belief that anybody who wants to restrict immigration in any way, shape or form is somehow a racist, which is completely mad, because that would then make governments in Australia, for example, of both stripes, both Labor and Coalition, it would make them racist. Australia does have an intensely restrictive immigration policy, but it also has very high rates of immigration, much higher than the United States or anywhere in the European Union or the UK, and has been much higher for decades. The idea that being in favour of immigration restriction is ipso facto racist is just nonsense. However, he is a bit of an edgelord, I think is probably a good way of putting it. He will be amusing at the expense of his political opponents, and they obviously don't tend to take it very well. And he does have history because he used to work for InfoWars, and I think it's reasonable to say that Alex Jones is as nutty as a bag of trail mix. So when these figures were banned, there was an enormous faffle on both sides of the Atlantic because there was a British person involved, and because Donald Trump, as is wont to do these days, he waded in. He tweeted, "I am continuing to monitor the censorship of American citizens on social media platforms. This is the United States of America, and we have what's known as freedom of speech. We are monitoring and watching closely." Now, I'm going to draw on an article that is of mine that is in this month's Standpoint magazine, and you should take my comments here as in addition or as an ancillary to what is in Standpoint magazine. I'm wearing my lawyer hat in the magazine and trying to make it as clear as possible what the law is on this point and some of the complexities arising from it. Because first of all, you've got to remember is that, among other things, Donald Trump actually retweeted a number of the people who'd been banned, including Paul Joseph Watson, which is quite unusual in itself because we've become used to, over the last couple of years, Twitter being the platform that bans people much more readily, and for very frivolous things like misgendering trans people. And sometimes you'll get a double whammy. Twitter will ban you or restrict your account. And then in the United Kingdom, because of malicious communications legislation and Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003, not because of hate speech legislation in this case, it's because of the internet misuse legislation, which is poorly adapted, but nonetheless widely used, for the simple reason that the country's hate speech legislation is relatively carefully drafted, and you would not be able to use it to do this. But you can use malicious communications legislation communications decency style legislation to achieve this effect. And what has happened with a number of very prominent people, including Graham Linehan, the chap who wrote Father Ted, this probably won't mean anything to Americans, but it does mean an enormous amount to British people, Irish people, French people, Australian people, because Father Ted was just a comedic standby for decades. Graham Linehan was the co-writer. He's a very left-wing activist, but he disagrees with the left on one particular issue, and that's the transgender issue. He's tweeted about it and had his account restricted or banned or suspended at various times, although he's back now. But he's also been investigated by the police, so he's had the police come round to his house and bang on his door and say, "Mr. Linehan, we want to check your thinking." And of course, this is an enormous issue because he's famous, but it's been done to lots and lots of other people who aren't famous. And the other one, not about trans people in this case, about teaching his dog to do a Nazi salute, is Marcus Meekin, Count Dankula, the comedian in Scotland. And once again, this is globally known purely because he's a well-known individual with hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter and his own comedy show. Although he's never been banned, he's drawn attention to both these cases. The comedian Jonathan Pye, and Pye sails very close to the wind but never steps over it. He's extraordinarily careful, but he has spoken and written widely about the situation with both Linehan and Meekin, and you've got the same sort of species of thing going on. So Twitter has always been censorious and has always been inclined to ban people, and occasionally it will interact with the police as well, so you get the state and a big corporate after you. So the fact that Donald Trump could simply go and retweet these people, some of whom had never been banned, was quite notable because of Twitter's censoriousness. Facebook was always the one that was sort of somewhere in the middle, and it was meant to be for puppies and kittens and pictures of babies and what people had done since you knew them in high school. And YouTube was always the one that was mainly music-focused and gaming-focused and also a bit more sort of liberal with this kind of thing. This is why you've created this entire media ecosystem with people like Sargon of Akkad, and these days with outfits like Trigonometry and so on and so forth. They've just created this entire media ecosystem of their own, and it's taken until quite recently, and probably the recent European Parliament elections, where some of the prominent YouTubers ran for Parliament or ran for the European Parliament. It'll be very interesting to see if any of them decide to repeat the thing at a general election. It will be quite entertaining to see how they try to run their campaigns, I'm not sure. So you had this sort of scale where Twitter was very censorious and YouTube wasn't really, and Facebook was somewhere in the middle. Then you got this situation where Facebook was used for the Christchurch shooter's live stream through his GoPro, and Facebook looked very bad as a result of this. I mean, the idea of live via telecast massacres, I often do quite a lot of commentary on ancient Rome because my training is as a classicist and I've written 2 novels set in ancient Rome. And I have to say the idea of live streaming a massacre is the kind of thing that would probably have appealed to a pagan Roman. They'd be sitting there going, "Cool idea, bro." But it is not something that goes down very well now. I mean, this is the difference between a civilization that never developed the idea of the watershed and our civilization, which does.